I was thinking this last week and just reflecting on what I've been trying to do in these last few weeks, and you may well have been thinking the same thing. The first week I spoke on David in the cave of Adullam, and those simple facts that God all these things were true for David, but they're true for us too, that in our cave of Adullam, as God will add people to this fellowship and cause it to grow before it sets out on whatever God is calling it to. God is for us, he's alive, he's personal, he's involved, he's active, he does things, but he does things in his own time, and God owns the future. Those are simple, basic facts that I needed to be reminded of, and hopefully we all do and did. Last week I spoke about the Lord being with us. He is our helper. He's with us and he's our helper. He may well be with Upton Vale. He may well be their helper, but he's with us and he's our helper. That's all the more important. When you're a fellowship of 500 or whatever it is, or 5,000 if you're in a mega church in America, well, it doesn't really matter whether the Lord's with you and he's your helper, because you can put on a pretty good show yourselves without him. But when you're a small fellowship, we need to know that actually there is a person who is alive and kicking, who is with us and will help us, not judge us, not condemn us, not break the bruised reed or snuff out the smouldering wick that we may feel we are. So what am I doing when I'm saying these things to myself and to you? I want to be reminded of who I am and what I am in Jesus Christ. I want you to be reminded of who you are and what you are. There's no point in trying to reinvent the wheel, try and find some deep hidden truth in the book of Leviticus. We just need to be reminded of who we are and what we are. And so often, we just take it for granted. Yeah, I'm a child, let's sing songs of praise. But am I the only Christian who likes to be told that God loves me, that he's with me, that I'm his child, that I've been adopted into his family, I've been chosen, accepted in the beloved in accordance with his pleasure and his grace? It did God good. That's not very good English, is it? But it did God good to save me. He chose me because it brought him pleasure. And he chose each of you because it brought him pleasure. We did not choose him, he chose us. And you can't get your head around it. There's no logic to it. It undermines any thoughts you might have that you've got it all together. And, God, no wonder God saved me. I'm the best thing since sliced bread. No, he chose us because he chose us, because he chose us. And it all comes out of this heart of love. Remember I said the other week, it's like a volcano of love, and we've got a good example of that on the news at the moment. Not a good example if you're living in Mallorca or wherever it is, but there's this ever-flowing torrent of God's love that comes towards us. So I want to be reminded of who I am and who we are. I want to be reminded of who he is and what he's like. And I think from that comes then an encouragement to believe that he actually is for us and he actually wants to do things. And I heard this week of the accommodation. We prayed about that, I think, last Sunday morning, and it's all unblocked. You think, oh, there's a coincidence. Well, it's a wonderful coincidence, isn't it? And it's great. So, I want to be reminded of who I am, of who we are, and that leads to encouragement to believe. And I need that, and perhaps I'm judging you. I'm judging Linda, that's for sure. But
join the queue there.
I'm judging, perhaps I'm putting on to you something that you never feel. But so this ended up just being a testimony or a sermon to me, if you like, or listen in, but I feel fragile. I'm easily shaken. I'm unsettled by things. I'm powerless. I live in a world that wants to ignore the message of Jesus, ridicule it, try and dismiss it as irrelevant for today's world. I am, as the Bible says, and that's what we're going to look at, a jar of clay. Did we get those pictures? This is the nearest thing you'll get to visual aids with me. A jar of clay. There you are, an earthenware pot, a jar of clay. I am a jar of clay, and a consequence of being a jar of clay is I need reassurance. I was out on my bike this week. It's a risky business, not because of the traffic, but because of the dogs. I would be a wealthy man if I had £10 for every time a dog owner has said to me, don't worry, he's fine with cyclists. You know in the next 5 seconds you're going to get a dog attached to your foot. Anyway, so this lady, variation on the theme, I'm cycling along, coming through the park by Holcombe there, and she said, oh, my dog's up there, you should be all right, but he might go for you. And I said, that's not very reassuring. So, I carried on, and thankfully he was all right. We need God's reassurance regarding stuff. You don't want me to say, well, things should be all right, God might be with us. That's no message of hope at all, is it? That's not good news. Potentially some news. We need to be reassured that Jesus is with us, that Jesus is alive, that Jesus is there, and that Jesus will use us. But it's against a backdrop of jars of clay. So let me just read to you these well-known verses from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 6 to 9. And this is what Paul says. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. So my first point, that was all just a preamble, that previous 10 minutes. My first point is, what am I? What am I? Christians often feel that their spiritual school report always says, could do better, position in class 29th out of 30. I say that because that was always on my report, my actual report. Could do better. Has the ability but lacks the application. That sort of stuff. Now, the first century practice was to have jars of clay in their homes in which they kept all sorts of things. But they also used to keep treasure in it. And that's what Paul's referring to in these verses. There's a jar of clay, but there's treasure in it. See, so often Christians see themselves as jars of clay. They feel that somehow or other they need to be constantly improving the look of the jar of clay, need to be tarting it up a bit, improving it, somehow or other tweaking it, getting the latest Kingsway Chuckaway paperback that will tell me how I can just make the jar of clay that much more impressive, that much more effective for Jesus. Churches often want to improve the jar of clay. I've been a minister of a church. I've spent a lot of time trying to improve the jar of clay, all the collective jars of clay, somehow or other to make it more appealing, more attractive. And I would suggest, after my 41 years as a Christian, that that's the wrong way of looking at it. Because no matter how much you improve the jar of clay, what really counts is the treasure that's within. Paul gets it. Paul is not trying to improve the jar of clay that he was, nor was he trying to improve the jars of clay that were in the church at Corinth that he wrote to. Rather, he focuses on the treasure within. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis, quite a shocking quote when I first heard it, was he said, Jesus didn't come to improve the old nature, he came to kill it. Now you think, whoa, but that's the reality. The old nature can't be improved. It's ruined by this thing called sin. What God does is put treasure within the old nature, and that treasure will never die. It's incorruptible, it's eternal. The old nature is passing away. So, to try and improve the old nature is just try to improve the jars of clay. So, Paul focuses on the treasure within. What we see in these verses is that in verses 8 and 9, with regard to Paul, that he didn't have a life that was all sorted. He's hard-pressed, he's perplexed, he's persecuted. It's not a life that is sorted. It's a life that knew pressure. It's a life that knew difficulties. It's a life that knew hardship. And the reason I highlight that is because I think so often I've got this little voice that says in my head, and surely yours as well, somehow if I'm going on with Jesus, I shouldn't be having these problems. It should be a lot neater, a lot tidier, a lot cleaner. Paul also talks in 1 Corinthians 2 to this same group of Christians that it was a life that wasn't all powerful. Yeah, this is Paul speaking, and he says, I came to you, talking to the people at Corinth, I came to you in weakness and fear and much trembling. It wasn't a life that was all powerful. He knew weakness and fear and trembling. You know, he's talking about what's going on deep within him. Paul also talked about a life that knew physical weakness. To the church in Galatia, chapter 4, verse 13, he said, as you well know, it was because of my illness that I first preached the gospel to you. So he's not, he's the guy who heals people. He's raised people from the dead. But he also knew what it was to be unwell. And also, it was a life that wasn't always successful. Acts 17:37, Paul's preaching to the crowd in Athens. And it says that when they heard about the resurrection, some of them sneered. Here's the Apostle Paul, anointed, empowered by God. But when he preached, there were some people who sneered. A life also that's not always respected. Once again, writing to this church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 6, he says, I might not be a trained speaker, but I have knowledge. There were obviously people who thought, listen to him. He hasn't been preaching classes, has he? He's never learned to speak properly. Because it was something that was valued in their culture, the ability to speak publicly. There were ways of doing it, and Paul didn't know how to do it. We are so often the same. I am so often the same, surely. We live lives that are hallmarked by pressure and difficulty, lives that are marked by strong emotions of fear, lives that are hallmarked by physical weakness, lives that are hallmarked by an apparent lack of success, lives when we can remember attempts to engage with people and talk to them about Jesus that have ended up as an utter failure. I remember talking to a minister whose name will remain hidden, and he was saying that he used to belong to a sports club, been playing squash, and after squash he'd gone into the sauna, and he was sat there, and there was this other guy in the sauna, and they were just sort of talking, and then out of the blue this other guy said to this minister, wouldn't it be great if you could find a sauna that would cleanse your soul? Now that is a golden opportunity to say, actually there is. That sauna's called Jesus. And being a good Baptist minister, what he said was, yeah, it would be good, wouldn't it? Somehow or other, seeing ourselves as jars of clay is very easy and logical. Why? Because we are. Now that might be a shock to some of you who think that you don't have any weaknesses or frailties, any cracks appearing. But for the vast majority of us, we know that we're jars of clay. We know that somehow or other it just hasn't worked out. But, it's not all that we are. And so often as Christians, we focus on the jar of clay, but it's not all that we are, because Paul goes on to say that there's something else within us. Action! Well, hey, crown jewels. There's treasure within. We are like the Tower of London. Crumbling edifices on the outside. Well, not that crumbling, but, you know. Weather-beaten edifice on the outside. Incredible riches on the inside. You see, I am a jar of clay. I went through a long period of my life where I thought, well, I'm not a jar of clay. You know, subconsciously, I read the Bible, good evangelical, yeah, I'm a jar of clay. But deep down, I thought I was probably a Ming vase or something like that. Not a Minging vase, but a Ming vase. Then after a little while, I thought, yeah, I'm not a Ming vase. I'm a bit of Wedgwood. But actually, and then I thought that, no, I'm not even a bit of Wedgwood, I'm Clarice Cliff. You know, a bit of Clarice Cliff pottery.
Still worth a fortune.
No, not anymore, Clarice Cliff. Not anymore, no. Anyway, the temptation is to look at people's lives that appear to be all sorted, the Ming Vase Christians, or the Wedgwood Christians, or even the Clarice Cliff Christians, and think they've got it all sorted. Look at my life. But of course, that's not true. Paul reminds me, and he reminds each of us, that it's not about what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside. And that was good news in Paul's day, because he was writing to people who couldn't compete with the Ming vases of the age. He describes in his first letter to this group of Christians in Corinth, he tells them that there weren't many of them that were wise, there weren't many of them that were influential, there were none of them that were of noble birth, they were foolish and weak, and that's what God was going to use to confound the strong and the mighty. They had no money, most of them were slaves, they had no prestige, there were no strings that they could pull, they couldn't drop any names. Oh yeah, well, of course I'm in with Emperor Claudius. You know, they couldn't, you know, or Maximus Meridius, or, you know, they had no names that they could drop to impress people. And yet, these ordinary people at the lower end of the social scale, with no strings of qualifications and all the rest of it, Paul reminds them that all that other stuff is just the jars of clay. What really counts is the treasure within. What is the treasure? Well, Paul goes on to talk about it, doesn't he? He says it is the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. Knowledge, that's not just head knowledge, but felt knowledge, heart knowledge. It's like a Christian said to me, you got to know it in your knower. You know, we've all of us got this hidden organ, a knower. And it's in your knower that you've got to know this light of Christ. You know, it's not just gobbledygook that Paul's talking about. It's a reality. It's the new nature. It's that thing that is communicated. You know, we all know, if you know, when you meet someone and you think, outside, you know, perhaps in the church as well, tragically, but you meet someone and you pick up not on what they say, not on what their face looks like, you pick up on them, the spirit that's within the person. You know people as well as I do that can say the most horrendous things and get away with it, because actually the spirit with which it's communicated is one of love. I'm looking at Linda there. You know, it's like, oh no, you can't possibly, she said it. But actually, the spirit is what is communicated. You don't stop at the words at face value. So what is Paul wanting to remind us and these Christians back in Corinth? He wants to remind us that we don't need to have status or standing in the world in order to have an impact. You know, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, you know, that great Baptist preacher of the 19th century, said that he learned more theology from the maid that lived in his mum and dad's house than from anyone else, because of what she was, the influence and impact that she had on his life. It means that there's something in us that can be and is being communicated to others. There's a life within us that's able to go through class barriers and money. I can remember I did a wedding when we were up in Bexley once, and it was for a guy in our church who worked up in the city, and he had a salary that went with working in the city. I remember one year him being bitterly disappointed that he'd only got a Are we all right?
No, don't worry, it's okay, she just needs to drink.
Right. Yeah, so this guy in the city, he was bitterly disappointed that he'd only got a £62,000 Christmas bonus. And his wife tried to point out to him that was 3 times more than the average wage of most people. And yeah, so he was bitterly disappointed. He married this Marianne, and invited a lot of his friends who worked up in the city to the wedding. And I remember speaking to the wife of his boss. The boss was a guy who has made so much money that he was funding film companies, small film companies to make films. He bought 2 £1.5 million apartments looking over the River Thames. And his wife was sort of dripping in jewels and gold and diamonds. Everything was designer label. And she came up to me and she said, "What is it that these people in the church have got?" She said, "I've got everything that money can buy, but I've got nothing compared to you." I thought that is a brilliant example of the treasure that we have within. And it's such a tragedy when Christians are sucked into this thinking that, what really counts is, obviously we want to have people who have careers and vocations, but we get so sucked into the embellishing and improving the jar of clay that we actually lose sight of the treasure within. Now, as I say, the negative example is the atmosphere that you can experience when you go into a home. You go into someone's home and there's just been a row. Nobody, everybody's saying the right thing. "Oh, come on in. You sit down." Nobody has to tell you, "We've just had a big row." You know it's happened. You can sense it. Same as going into churches, isn't it? You can go into churches and the walls are telling you, the chairs are telling you, everything about the atmosphere is saying, "No, we do not like human beings in this place." And we say we do, but you know very well that that's not the case. We all know it, tragically, to be true. Well, conversely, this treasure within communicates itself. It's the thing that makes people say, "There's something different about you." The problem we have is we live in a culture, they'll say, "There's something different about you." What is it that you've got? Is it indigestion? Is it a vegan diet? Is it you practice yoga? Our opportunity is to say, actually, I do have indigestion, but the real difference is I've got treasure within, and it's called Jesus. It's the life of Jesus deep within us. And it's the treasure is what counts. And as I said just now, I have realised over the years that what has been emphasised in church is not the treasure, but the jars of clay, making the jars more appealing, more attractive, more academic, better dressed. Thankfully, well, there's not a tie in sight here, but the days of having to dress up to go to church, those have long since gone in most places. Hats! Oh no, there's a funny story about hats. There used to be someone at Upton Vale, this lady who was so incensed by the fashion parade that took place every week with all the hats, that one week she turned up and she had 3 or 4 on her head. I knew another guy who was one of the lecturers at Bible College. He was brought up in a Brethren assembly where having a head covering was essential. And he said it just got to be ludicrous, because at the back of the church, they had a box of hats. So if a lady turned up without a hat, they'd sort of say, "Well, help yourself, you've got to put one on." But he was saying it was ridiculous, because you might have a fascinator on, which is basically, you ladies know, every time you go to a wedding, you buy a fascinator. You think, have I really paid £75 for a feather with a hair grip? Well, that would do, because it's a head covering. Anyway, I digress. So much so that, what was I talking about? But, you know, the church is focused on this, you know, this thing about the jars of clay and how we can make them better, how we can make the jars of clay better, rather than drawing us to Jesus. Rather than drawing us to Jesus. Yeah, I remember once again at Upton Vale, when I was first saved, 1980, 250 people at the midweek Bible study, 20 at the prayer meeting. You think, see, we were emphasising the jars of clay. You know, we obviously want to study the scriptures, improving our academic, our understanding, but actually going in and spending time with the source of the treasure that wants to appeal them. Now, it seems to me here in Roselands Community Church, if I may be so bold, the jars of clay are very evident. Some more so than others. Linda?
Gosh, I never get
So and it's a wonderful opportunity because all that can be displayed, you know, I say it within reason, but all that can be displayed is the treasure. That's the wonderful opportunity. When you have nothing, all that you can display is the treasure. When you can't sort of say, well, you see my qualifications. You know, if I say to you, here's my qualifications, my certificates, 3 O-levels, grade 6, and a CSE grade 1, you think, you know, I can't offer anything, can I? I've got nothing to impress anybody with. But there is treasure within. I am reminded today that I am indeed a jar of clay. And if I didn't need reminding from these verses that I've read, my things that have happened to me in this last week have proved to me, if ever I needed proving, I am a jar of clay. It's been difficult. You know, I've had my row with Ruth, you know, it's like, what is this going on? How can I stand up on a Sunday? I can stand up on a Sunday. It's living proof that I am a jar of clay. But there is treasure within. And I want to focus, and I want us all to be encouraged as we focus not on the reality of the jar of clay, but on the treasure that is within each one of us. You know, it's easy to look on what we aren't. Paul reminds his readers of what they are. They are vehicles for treasure. There is treasure within each one of us today. So I want to encourage us to say to ourselves, yeah, I'm a rust bucket of a vehicle, but the boot is full of treasure. I'm one of the Lord's strong boxes, dressed up in a jar of clay. I'm a portable bank vault in which he has placed riches beyond imagining. I'm a gold bullion convoy flanked by heavily armed angel outriders, conveying the Lord's riches through this world. I'm Fort Knox on wheels. I'm the Tower of London's crown jewels on safari. I am a child of the living God in which he has placed his treasure. This is the full truth about us. Jars of clay and treasure, earthenware pots and precious jewels, dirt and diamonds. This is what needs to shape my thinking and our thinking more and more and more. Is that worth hallelujah?
Hallelujah, brother.
Thank you. Amen. Any comments, Linda?
That's next week's poem.
I did say that that's why I've got Big Belly, because it's full of treasure.
But yes. Yes.
Agree with me.
No, I do, Linda. Yes, it's
Visible.
yes, there's a lot of treasure there. Yes.
Can't say anything with that one.
Anybody got any comments? Anything to say? Any testimonies? Anything? Anything? Please, something. If not, we'll move on to Maggie's favourite song.
Just one of them.
Okay.
You see, we're so satisfied with what you feed us with. So there are no questions.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because Paul also talks about some of the rules in worship and things like that elsewhere, doesn't
Yeah.
he? He talks about head coverings and things like that, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's a you can see where the confusion creeps in,
Yeah,
can't you?
yeah. And I think, there's nothing wrong with head coverings. In fact, I'm going to get a toupee myself. But it's when it detracts from the treasure.
Yeah.
The fundamental thing is the treasure. I used to know a lady, still do know her, and language-wise, you think, oh, that's not the sort of language that Christians use usually. But the treasure was so evident in her life. She had so many people that wanted to talk to her about Jesus. She didn't focus on the rules and things. She just let this treasure be on display, And it's there, isn't it? It's there in us. And I think, one of the tragedies of the church has been it has created a culture that has unwittingly stopped the treasure from being visible because of its rules and attitudes and behaviour. It's all well-meaning, but you know as well as I do, and probably the reason why you're part of Roselands is because there's so many do's and don'ts. It became a religion of not. God is the one who's always saying, can't do that. Is that a glass of Coca-Cola you got in your hand, Neil? Don't like that. Woe betide a glass of wine. And it's that religion of nots. I think, Ruth's parents, in their 90s now, but, when they were growing up, they were in church. Christians didn't go to the cinema, they didn't go to the theatre, they didn't go dancing, they certainly didn't drink. Some of them may have smoked, but it wasn't looked on too well. And it was all these things that were cultural, but not biblical. Interestingly, in France, when we lived in France, it was acceptable to drink, obviously, but not acceptable to smoke. It's because it's a cultural thing, Yeah, but we have treasure.
Thank you.
Paparazzi are in again.